Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a really fascinating and sometimes pretty brutal look at the invisible architecture that held up some of the ancient world's most famous civilizations.
Mhm.
Forget the Colosseum, forget the Parthenon just for a moment. We are diving deep into the complex, often contradictory, and deeply revealing rules that govern things like status, obligation, and violence.
Right. From Athenian courts all the way to the distant Roman provinces.
Exactly.
It's true, the big monuments that grab your eye. But the real, maybe the enduring genius of these societies, especially Rome, was in their attempt to, well, systematize order.
Right, to create a framework.
Yeah, all that physical stuff, the cities, the armies, the incredible wealth, it was all supported by these intricate, constantly evolving legal frameworks. These systems basically defined who you were, what you could own, and, crucially, how you could settle a score without, society just collapsing into chaos.
So our mission today is to try and distill some key insights from, well, it's a pretty rich stack of sources we've looked at. Stuff covering Athenian popular justice, the really profound evolution of Roman private law.
Yeah, things like contract law, the law around slavery.
Exactly. And also the, let's say, the gritty, sometimes profit-driven reality of Roman imperial administration and judicial privilege. It's the law beneath the land, really.
And it tells you so much more about the priorities, the inequalities of these ancient cultures than maybe any statue ever could.
Okay, so let's kick things off in Athens. When we talk about Athenian democracy, we often focus on, elections, rhetoric, that sort of thing.
The political side.
Right. But underlying that political freedom was a society still, well, struggling to move past these cycles of violent retribution. So to really get Athenian law, we have to start with that basic effort to move beyond the blood feud.
And that means talking about Draco.
It does. His laws are famously harsh. We all know the term draconian. But he's often credited with this really crucial societal shift, basically suppressing violent retaliation and replacing it with formalized lawsuits.
And that shift, it was truly transformative because it was pushing against a really deeply ingrained social norm. The sources, they strongly suggest that before the legal system really took hold, violent reprisal wasn't just, permitted.
It was expected.
It was ritualized, almost a required social duty. And the customs surrounding homicide really show how difficult that transition away from pure revenge must have been.
And those customs, they were incredibly specific, weren't they? We have this really striking evidence of these pre-legal practices that almost seem designed to, well, legitimize escalating the feud.
Exactly right. Think about the rituals after someone was killed. The victim's family, they carry a spear in the funeral procession, symbolizing the ongoing, almost military nature of the injury. It wasn't over. They were expected to stand guard over the grave for 3 days straight.
Wow.
And they'd make a public proclamation, essentially naming the killer, warning society about what was coming. And maybe most critically, the victim's family kept the right to witness, maybe even participate in, the killer's eventual execution.
So these weren't just mourning rituals in our sense.
Not at all. They were the formalized stages of the blood feud. They made sure society recognized and respected the need for lethal retaliation. It was baked into the system.
So when Draco brings in homicide law and the system starts churning out lawsuits instead of just revenge killings, that's not just a minor regulatory tweak.
Oh, it's a massive cultural achievement. A success story, really. The law somehow managed to funnel that raw social rage into institutional channels.
Preventing those endless cycles of tit-for-tat violence between families.
That's the ultimate function, isn't it, of early codified law, imposing state control over the most fundamental, most dangerous human conflicts. And speaking of controlling violence, this brings us neatly to how Athenian law handled acts of malicious abuse, hubris, especially how it relates to status.
Yeah, we often assume Athenian democracy was only obsessed with crimes against citizens, right? But the legislator, it seems, took a surprisingly broad view here.
They did. The sources suggest that acts of physical violence, this malicious abuse, were seen as crimes against the entire citizen body, not just the individual victim.
Which is why the state got involved, providing public assistance to the victim.
Exactly. And the rationale wasn't really about universal human rights as we think of it today. It was more about civic order, the common good.
Okay.
The thinking, it seems, was that while few individuals have the inherent strength or the social clout to resist violence from powerful people on their own.
Right. Most people are vulnerable.
Everyone must have recourse to the law. Otherwise, you get tyranny, you get public disorder. If the strong could just assault the weak whenever they felt like it, The whole idea of democracy would just fall apart.
And this is where we hit that really surprising detail, isn't it? The one that kind of flips our modern assumptions about Athenian priorities on their head.
It really does. The focus was entirely on the nature of the aggressive act itself, not primarily on the status of the person who was wronged.
So you're saying?
I'm saying a public action for malicious abuse could be brought even if the victim was a slave.
Even a slave. That's remarkable.
It is. The law chose to focus on the pernicious nature of the action, the willingness of one person to commit that kind of outrage, because that act itself was seen as intolerable, a crime against the state, against public order.
So the victim, whether they were free or enslaved, they were compensated. How? Not necessarily financially?
Not always directly, no. The compensation, in a way, was the public punishment of the aggressor. The crime being punished was disorder, the threat to the community, not just the individual's loss.
That completely shifts the moral weight, doesn't it? You're prosecuting to uphold the social contract itself.
Precisely. And this focus on character, on the moral meaning of actions, leads us right into the messy reality of Athenian courts, what our sources call the sociology of litigation.
Yeah, these court battles, they clearly weren't just about dry, narrow legal fact-finding.
Absolutely not. The sources are pretty clear that litigation often served as a kind of formal extension of feuding behavior. It was a way to settle long-standing personal rivalries, air grievances.
Well, the court was just another arena for the feud.
In many ways, yes. And judges and litigants, they seem to have acknowledged this reality. The courtroom was just the current battlefield for these ongoing conflicts.
So if I take my neighbor, my rival, to court in Athens, the judgment isn't just going to hang on whether he technically broke some statute.
It's much broader than that. That's the key difference. Judgment frequently hinged on the social and moral meaning of the act. And that meaning was, completely tied up with the parties' social identity, their reputation, their wealth.
Sure, their friends were.
Absolutely. The clout of their friends and supporters who would show up and vouch for them, the legal orders, the speechwriters, they spent enormous amounts of time, not just on the alleged offense itself, but on painting their client as a good, upstanding citizen.
Right, someone who pays his taxes, serves in the military, respects tradition.
Exactly. And portraying the opponent as morally bankrupt, untrustworthy, a danger to the city. It was like a holistic moral audit conducted in public, not just a clinical legal evaluation of one specific act.
It sounds incredibly personal, intense, which I suppose brings us back to that really loaded term in Athenian law, hubris. It seems to go beyond just simple physical assault. It captures wrongs that really cut deep into, well, the fabric of honor and reputation.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Hubris meant an act of shameful outrage, typically involving violating boundaries, challenging someone's status. It often involved wrongs that victims were actually too ashamed to talk about publicly.
Like what kind of things?
Particularly acts against their women or their sons. Anything that stained the male head of household's reputation for controlling his dependents, his oikos.
And our sources give us a pretty brutal insight into the power dynamics of honor when it comes to adultery specifically.
Adultery was explicitly classified as hubris, not just against the woman, but crucially against her husband.
And this held true even if the woman consented.
The sources are clear on that, regardless of whether the woman consented. The core offense wasn't seen as primarily sexual. It was a violation of the husband's property rights over his wife, and therefore a direct attack on his honor and his standing in the community.
And the law gave the husband quite extreme rights.
The absolute right to kill the adulterer if caught in flagrante delicto, caught in the act.
Wow. But if the husband chose not to kill the adulterer, what then?
Well, the preferred form of non-lethal revenge was often codified humiliation.
So punishment designed to shame.
Precisely. Because the adulterer had committed hubris, had degraded the husband's reputation, the sources cite specific acts of sexual humiliation as an appropriate, even legally sanctioned retaliation.
So the law actually permitted certain degrading acts.
Yes, not just as random punishment, but as a way to restore the balance of honor that had been disrupted. It really shows the profound difference between, say, modern legal systems, which often try to remove emotion from punishment.
Right, keep it objective.
And the Athenian system, which actively institutionalized honor and shame as primary judicial mechanisms. It's a very different world.
Okay, so let's transition now. We move from that very personalized, reputation-heavy justice of Athens to the the rigorous, systematic, and often quite abstract legal mind of Rome.
A very different beast.
Here, the genius seems to lie much more in codification, especially in private law. And the evolution of Roman contract law, that shows a really fascinating progression, doesn't it? Moving from absolute rigidity towards a much more nuanced understanding of, like, subjective intent.
Absolutely. This development is absolutely central to the Roman legal legacy,
Yeah.
why it was so influential later on. Initially, Roman agreements were incredibly bound by strict formal observance. You had to say the exact words, perform the exact ritual.
Get it wrong, Anne.
Get it wrong, the contract was void. Didn't matter what the parties actually intended or agreed to. The form was everything. The first big sort of philosophical leap beyond that rigidity was the introduction of what legal historians call real contracts.
Real contracts. What defined those? Does real mean tangible?
Exactly. It required the actual transfer of a physical thing, like a loan of money, or depositing an item for safekeeping to create the legal obligation. And for the first time, the law recognized a kind of moral duty.
How so?
It forbade a party from backing out of the agreement just because of some minor technical defect in the form, if some part of the agreement had already been performed.
Ah, so if the money had already been handed over, for instance.
Precisely. The law acknowledged that because something tangible had changed hands, a corresponding vinculum juris, a legal bond, was created. This was huge. It shifted the focus just a bit away from pure ceremony towards the actual transaction itself.
And that then paved the way for the most sophisticated form, the consensual contract.
Indeed. The consensual contract really marked the final stage in this evolution. This recognized that for certain really common types of commercial agreements, things like sales, leases, partnerships, mandates.
Everyday business stuff.
Right. For those, the external formality, the ritual, was basically irrelevant. The mental attitude, as the jurists called it, the shared intention of the contractors, that was solely regarded as the source of the legal obligation.
So the written document or maybe exchanging tokens, that stuff just served as evidence of the internal commitment. It wasn't the commitment itself.
Exactly right. Evidence, not the essence. And this philosophical progression, moving from absolute external ritual to focusing on internal intent, it was absolutely necessary for a rapidly expanding commercial empire.
Made business easier, faster.
It allowed commerce to move at the speed of thought, you could say, rather than being bogged down by the speed of bureaucracy and ritual. And the sheer intellectual leap needed to develop concepts like the theory of natural law, which we'll get to, or the formal notion of that vinculum juris, the legal bond. Our sources really emphasize these as uniquely Roman contributions to legal thought.
Okay, so moving from abstract obligations like contracts to the most concrete definition of status imaginable, Roman slavery. Even within this, most tragic of institutions, the Roman legal mind introduced a theoretical concept, the law of nature, that seems to have had some profound long-term mitigating effects. Is that right?
It is, and it's a complex point. The theory of the law of nature provided a kind of critical theoretical break on the tendency to view slaves purely as objects, as articles of property, like livestock.
How did it do that?
Well, the jurists recognized this tension. According to the Elias Gentium, the law of nations, or the Arius Roman civil law, slavery was an established legal fact. It existed. But according to natural law, the philosophical ideal, all human beings were born free.
So there's a clash between the ideal and the reality.
Exactly. This dichotomy, recognizing a natural state of freedom versus a civil state of servitude, meant that Roman jurisprudence could never entirely reduce the slave to the status of, say, a mule or a rock. There was always that lingering philosophical acknowledgement of underlying humanity.
And you mentioned earlier this legal viewpoint actually had tangible, real-world consequences centuries later in other places.
The sources point to a really striking historical comparison. It seems that wherever systems of servitude were later sanctioned by institutions that had been deeply influenced by Roman jurisprudence.
Like in parts of Europe or colonies.
Right. The condition of the slave was arguably less intolerably wretched than in places where the legal framework was maybe more purely utilitarian or based on different traditions.
And the specific example cited was Louisiana.
Yes, the highly Romanized legal code of Louisiana is often contrasted with other slave systems in the American South. The argument is that the prospects and the daily life of the enslaved population were often, perhaps, slightly less harsh due to these older, Roman-derived legal precedents that recognized at least some minimal level of human dignity, however compromised.
That's a really remarkable legacy, isn't it? An abstract legal theory potentially impacting individual suffering centuries down the line.
It is.
Yet, we also have to confront that tragic irony. The law defined slavery, but the very act of freeing slaves, manumission, often ended up reinforcing the system itself.
This is absolutely crucial to understand. If you analyze slavery not just morally, but as an economic system, the manumission of individual slaves, even if it was an act of kindness or a reward for loyalty, actually served as a major structural reinforcement of the institution as a whole.
How did freeing one person strengthen the overall system? That seems counterintuitive.
It boils down to a capitalization cycle. Slaves frequently had to pay, or promised to pay over time, substantial sums of money for their freedom, often far exceeding their market value as a slave.
So they bought themselves, essentially.
Yes, or someone bought them for the purpose of freeing them. But the key is the price. The prospect of maybe, one day, achieving liberty kept the slave highly motivated, industrious, and frankly under control for potentially decades.
Working towards that goal.
Exactly. And the master, by demanding and receiving this substantial price for manumission, immediately gained liquid capital, cash in hand,
Which they could then use
to purchase a younger replacement slave, thereby maintaining the overall chattel population, the workforce, and the wealth derived from it. The hope of freedom, paradoxically, became financially self-sustaining for the slave economy.
That's grimly logical. Nevertheless, the Roman legal system, it seems, was still capable of great nuance, particularly in cases where affection or, family relationships were involved, even for people legally defined as property. We see this complexity in the mandate law.
Yes, the mandate law is a good example. It deals with instructions given to a third party to do something. Now, technically, a slave couldn't enter into a binding contract, including giving a mandate, say, to buy himself.
Because they lacked legal standing.
Right. So if a slave told a friend, please buy me from my master so I can be free, and the friend bought him, but then refused to actually free him.
The slave had no legal recourse.
Technically, no. The mandate was ineffective because the slave couldn't give it in the first place. It's harsh logic.
But the jurists found a way around this, an exception.
They did, rooted in the important Roman legal concept of bona fides acting in good faith. If the mandate given wasn't just buy me, but specifically buy me and manumit me, and the buyer failed to do the second part, the freeing part,
Then the law could intervene.
yes, the master, having received the purchase price, was sort of out of the picture legally. But an action on mandate could potentially lie against the buyer, the friend who broke his promise. And critically, this action could be brought for the benefit of the slave.
But who would bring the action if the slave still couldn't?
Others could bring it on the slave's behalf, and the sources explicitly state that this was often allowed by reason of affection, particularly if the slave happened to be, say, a natural son or maybe a brother of the person who was supposed to buy and free him.
So the courts acknowledged family ties.
Yes, the Roman jurists agreed that affection, these natural bonds, could and should be considered in actions based on good faith. It shows a clear willingness sometimes to bend the cold logic of property law to accommodate fundamental human relationships, even within the brutal context of slavery.
Okay, let's shift status categories again. Let's look at women who were sui iuris. That means legally independent, right? Not under the patria potestas, the paternal power of a living male relative.
Correct. They were independent in that sense. They managed their own day-to-day affairs, their property to some extent, but they didn't have full, completely unfettered legal capacity like an adult man sui iuris.
They still needed oversight for certain things.
Yes, they still required what was called tutores auctoritas, the tutor's authority, or approval for certain key legal actions.
What kind of actions needed this approval?
Primarily actions that could significantly impact their wealth or long-term financial standing. Things like alienating major assets, particularly assets known as res mancipi, or incurring significant contractual obligations like taking out large loans.
What exactly were res mancipi again?
Ah, yes. These were considered the core foundational assets of a traditional Roman family. Think land in Italy, slaves, draft animals like oxen and horses, and certain old agricultural rights. Transferring these required a very specific, formal legal ritual called mancipatio.
So the tutor's signature, essentially, was needed to protect the woman from making rash decisions about her most valuable, often inherited, wealth. Was that the idea?
That was the original idea, yes. Protection. But in practice, especially by the classical period,
It became less about protection.
increasingly yes. It often became, as one source puts it, a mere matter of necessary form. Dicis causa, just ticking a box.
Why? Did the tutor have any skin in the game?
That's the key. The tutor generally incurred no real responsibility or liability for giving or withholding his authority. He wasn't on the hook if the woman made a bad deal after he approved it.
So no real incentive to be diligent.
Not really. And furthermore, if the tutor wasn't a legitimate designated guardian based on family ties, like an uncle, but maybe just a patron or someone appointed, the praetor, the chief judicial magistrate in Rome, could actually compel him to give that authority if he was being difficult for no good reason.
So it really was just a formality by that point.
For many women sui juris, it seems it had largely become a formalistic relic, yeah. A legal hoop to jump through.
Did this requirement for a tutor's consent eventually fade away or change in later Roman law?
It did evolve, yes.
Yeah.
Especially in late antiquity, as emancipation freeing children from patria potestas even while the father lived became more common. The focus started to shift away from tutelage based on sex and more towards age, towards standardizing the age of majority for everyone.
So what replaced it?
For marriage consent specifically, the rule changed. It became required for all women under the age of 25, regardless of whether they were technically emancipated and independent, sui juris, or still under their father's patria potestas.
Interesting. So it's standardized based on age, not paternal control.
Exactly. It reflected perhaps the state's growing interest in ensuring reasonably informed marital decisions, moving away from the somewhat arbitrary constraint of whether the father was alive or not, and towards a more standardized age of legal maturity for making such a big commitment.
Okay, now let's zoom out to the vast scale of the Roman Empire itself and the mechanisms of law that structured its administration, particularly how they ran the provinces.
Right. A huge topic.
And this system, it seems designed for efficiency, maybe, but also structurally designed for extraction and based almost entirely on status.
Absolutely. Provincial administration, for the most part, relied on high-status amateur politicians back in Rome. Senators, ex-magistrates, they'd hold office, like governor, relatively briefly, typically just for a year.
And their motivation wasn't purely public service.
Let's just say the motivations were mixed. Enhancing their status through public display was part of it, sure. But critically, it was seen as a prime opportunity to make a profit, a very significant profit.
Our sources suggest the potential profit was, well, staggering.
It really was. It was almost an expected perk of the job for many. Governors had immense power locally, especially over supervising tax collection and dispensing justice. They could, and very often did, accumulate enough profit in that single year to basically set up their family fortune for generations.
Well, it wasn't just about covering expenses.
Oh, far beyond that. For many of the Roman elite, a tour in the provinces wasn't just service. It was almost a necessary financial move, a way to restore family fortunes that had been massively depleted by the immense costs of running for election back in Rome. You had to spend a fortune to get elected, then you went to a province to make it back, and then some.
It sounds like the ultimate institutionalized kickback scheme.
That's not an unfair description in many cases.
And the sheer scale of this exploitation, it must have been enormous, because it led to the creation of the very first permanent judicial tribunal back in Rome, didn't it?
It did. It was systemic. The complaints coming back from the provinces, from provincials, local elites, even Roman citizens living there, about illegal extortion reputundae, became so loud, so frequent, that the Senate finally established a permanent standing court, the Quaestio de Repetundis, in the 149 BC, specifically to handle these cases.
A major development in Roman legal history.
A landmark, absolutely. The start of Rome's permanent criminal court system.
But did this tribunal actually work? Did it function as a genuine safety net for the provincials who'd been fleeced by corrupt governors?
Well, yes and no. It offered them a chance, albeit a small one, to maybe recover a fraction of their losses and sometimes to punish the most outrageously rapacious governors, get them exiled perhaps.
But there was another side to it.
The sources strongly suggest a deeper, maybe more cynical function. Through its judgments, through the compromises reached, even through its acquittals, this tribunal often, perhaps unintentionally, ended up establishing a kind of convention, a baseline understanding of the level of extortion that would likely be condoned, or at least not severely punished.
So it didn't actually eliminate corruption, it just sort of set the acceptable price for it.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It provided a feedback loop. A governor heading out might think, okay, I can't take everything, that might get me prosecuted successfully, but I can probably get away with this much. The tribunal, in a way, helped calibrate the acceptable limits of plunder without risking serious political consequences back home.
So the legal system adapted to the administrative misconduct rather than fully correcting it.
That's a good way to put it. It managed it, perhaps, more than eliminated it.
Okay, shifting gears slightly within administration. Let's look at the ultimate judicial authority, the emperor himself. Even with thousands of magistrates scattered across the empire, the emperor still exercised routine jurisdiction, right? Hearing cases personally.
Absolutely. The emperor was the final court of appeal, of course, but he also frequently acted as a court of first instance for major cases or cases involving important people or novel legal questions.
And it's interesting that our sources note this ambiguity in his role when he was judging.
Yes, sometimes he acted purely as emperor, invoking his ultimate sovereign power, his imperium. Other times, he specifically performed the jurisdiction as consul if he happened to be holding that annual office that year.
Why the distinction?
It's subtle, but it demonstrated that judicial power flowed directly from his personal authority, his auctoritas, regardless of the specific constitutional hat he was wearing at the moment. It reinforced his supremacy over all other sources of law.
Now, that formal extension of the Roman citizen's right of appeal, the right to appeal to the emperor across the whole vast empire, must have had major practical consequences for provincial governors on the ground.
Oh, huge operational constraints. The fact that any Roman citizen accused of a serious crime had the right to appeal their case back to Rome meant that governors often didn't even try to handle those cases locally.
They just shipped them off.
For capital offenses or anything politically sensitive involving a citizen, they'd often automatically send the accused back to the capital for trial by the emperor or his designated courts. It avoided tricky legal challenges to their own authority.
And we see this play out in Pliny's letters.
Vividly illustrated, yes. Pliny the Younger, when he's governor of Pontus in modern-day Turkey, encounters Christians. He interrogates them, executes the non-citizens who persist, but the ones who claim Roman citizenship. He explicitly says he has to send them back to Rome for judgment. He recognizes the absolute, non-negotiable status privilege that came with being a Roman citizen, even far from Italy.
And this powerful emphasis on status, it permeates the punishment system itself, leading to what's often called the dual penalty system. Roman law explicitly maintained different penalties based on social rank.
Yes, the distinction was legally codified and enforced. We have clear evidence regarding the crime of falsum, which covered forgery, fraud, counterfeiting, even perjury sometimes.
And the punishments varied.
Significantly, depending on status. Decurions, those are the local elites, the city council members in provincial towns, they generally receive milder penalties than the plebei, the common free population, for the exact same act of fraud or forgery.
And this wasn't just about paying different fines, was it? Status could determine the very form of punishment you received.
Precisely. The most fundamental dividing line, of course, was between free persons and slaves. Free persons, even lower status ones, typically atoned for most non-capital offenses with a fine, or maybe banishment, or loss of certain civic rights. Penalties that reflected their status as property holders and participants, however minimally, in the civic order.
Whereas slaves?
Slaves, lacking that legal personhood and property, were almost always subjected to corporal punishment for similar offenses. Whipping, lashing, sometimes much worse, like condemnation to the mines or the arena. The state essentially extracted either cash or flesh, depending entirely on the legal status of the person who committed the wrong.
It's stark. Finally, let's dig into one last area of Roman legal sophistication, how they assigned liability and valued damage under the Lex Aquilia. This was the key law governing unlawful damage to property, right?
Yes, a cornerstone of Roman tort law dealing with wrongful harm to property.
So if someone damaged or killed, say, a slave belonging to someone else, how was that loss calculated? It wasn't just the slave's market price.
No, it was potentially much broader. The valuation wasn't simply, what would this slave fetch at auction? It was calculated based on how much it was worth to the plaintiff, the owner's specific loss.
Which could include knock-on effects.
Exactly. The calculation specifically included consequential damage. The ripple effect, the loss of that slave or animal or object, had on the owner's entire economic enterprise or assets.
Could you give us an example of how that consequential damage might be figured out?
Certainly. The jurists were incredibly detailed about this stuff. For instance, if someone killed one member of a highly trained troupe of actors or musicians that you owned,
Okay.
or maybe one of a matched pair of expensive carriage mules, the valuation included not only the estimated value of the actor or mule destroyed, but also the diminished value of the remaining members of the troupe or the surviving mule. Because the set was now incomplete, less valuable as a functional unit.
That makes sense. Any other examples?
Another classic one. If a slave who had been named as an heir in someone else's will was killed before your slave could formally accept the inheritance, which would then pass to you, the master.
Hmm.
The value of that lost, expected inheritance was included in the damages you could claim under the Lex Aquilia.
Wow. That's a stunning level of economic sophistication, really, for valuing what was legally considered property.
It shows how deeply intertwined law and commerce were.
One last point on the Lex Aquilia. How did the law assign liability if the damage was caused by, say, a free person, but they were acting under someone else's instructions, like a soldier damaging property on orders?
Good question. Liability generally rested with the person who gave the orders, provided that person had the legitimate legal right to give those orders in that situation.
Like a military commander.
Exactly. A military commander directing a soldier in the course of duty, or perhaps a master instructing his own slave. If the person giving the orders had that kind of legal authority, they bore the liability for the damage caused.
But what if the person giving the orders didn't have the right? If it was just some guy telling his friend to break something?
Then the liability shifted.
Hmm.
If the person giving the orders had no such legal authority, if they were acting outside their official capacity or beyond the scope of any legal power they held, then the action for damages was brought directly against the actual wrongdoer, the person who physically caused the damage.
So it ensured accountability, even when there was a chain of command involved, but it respected legitimate authority, too.
Precisely. It tried to pinpoint the legally responsible party within that chain.
Well, we have definitely completed an exhaustive deep dive today. We've moved all the way from the necessary violence, perhaps, of Athenian popular courts to the hyper-systematic Roman apparatus dealing with contract, status, privilege, and even surprisingly detailed economic damage valuation.
Yeah, what really stands out, I think, is the sheer volume, the sheer depth of legal thought that was required to manage societies that were, at the same time, incredibly large, very complex, and also deeply, fundamentally unequal. The Roman legal mind, in particular, developed concepts we've touched on, things like bona fides, vinculum juris, the influence of natural law, that really provided the intellectual framework for legal systems for centuries afterward.
You can see that lineage.
You really can. They show this profound historical self-consciousness about legal change, how law develops over time, and this foundational concern for the capacity of legal language, of precise definitions, to regulate, well, almost every corner of their world. That tradition is, quite literally, the basis for the civil law systems across much of Europe and beyond today.
That durability is just astounding. And yet, thinking back through our conversation, amidst all that calculation, all that status obsession, the rigid formalism, we did find those moments, didn't we?
We did.
Those small exceptions, maybe. Like the Mandate Law concerning the slave's manumission, where the jurists, it seems, consciously chose to prioritize something like affection or good faith over the pure, cold financial property right of the master.
Exactly. Those little cracks where maybe something else shone through.
And that, I think, raises a really important final question, something for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. We've seen this ancient Roman system, absolutely obsessed with status, with hierarchy, with formal rules, but still somehow capable of valuing affection and good faith, at least in certain private actions.
So the question becomes, does studying ancient law like this suggest that legal formalism itself, despite all its inherent rigidity, its structure, its potential for unfairness, does it sometimes, maybe inadvertently, open up necessary spaces for compassion?
Yes.
Or for individual interest, spaces that perhaps pure arbitrary political power, unchecked by law, might have otherwise simply suppressed?
Yeah.
Is there sometimes a hidden humanity within the structure of law itself?